We do pack an awful lot into this talk, I should say, but anybody, you're all very welcome to email Tegan and I after this if there's anything that you miss, or if there's any sort of additional information that you would like. You can get our contact details from Joe, and we're more than happy to have a chat sort of at a later date about any aspect of the talk, or indeed any aspect of the Charles Archive and the project. Tegan and I are both archaeologists at Explore the Past, and we're involved in a lot of projects, but I have to say, on a personal level, the Charles Archive project was an absolute joy to be involved with. Not only were we able to look through a fantastic array of material, we were also able to learn about two absolutely fascinating characters who, through their work, helped to influence not only the landscape of Worcestershire, but of Bromsgrove as well. Oops, dear. There we go. So I'm going to talk to you about the development of the project, some of its aims and outcomes. I'm then going to talk about Freddie and Mary Charles, so who they were as individuals and why their professional partnership was so successful. Finally, I'm going to share with you a couple of my favourite pieces from the archives. I'm then going to pass over to Tegan, who's going to talk about some of the research that they undertook, some of the theories that they brought forward, some of the techniques that they employed, and some of the local campaigns. And we've got a fair few Bromsgrove examples as well as examples from across the rest of the county. Okay, so the archive of FWB, also known as Freddie, and Mary Charles Chartered Architects, was presented to the Worcestershire Records Office shortly before Freddie's death back in 2002. The archive included an extensive collection of photographs, slides, plans, drawings, and project workbooks relating to buildings both across Worcestershire and out of county. Freddie and Mary's gift also included copyright for all of the material for which they themselves held copyright. Now, Worcestershire Archive and Archaeology Service, so we merged with the archives a few years ago. We first approached Historic England back in 2016 with the idea of electronically cataloguing the archive, which up until that point had only been catalogued on paper, so was really difficult to search. Historic England agreed to fund the project, and it was agreed that as well as digitally cataloguing the archive, the project would create a digital photographic archive of the most important material, and that this would be made publicly accessible. So all of the images that you see on this slide are available on the public domain, and we'll give details later on about how you can access them. The project also aimed to establish the location and nature of any related material held within other archives across the country, and to support the transfer of any out-of-county material that we held ourselves. Oh. So some of the other main aims of the project: we aim to help secure the preservation of historic buildings and conservation areas through informed conservation management. We were hoping to improve understanding of Worcestershire's heritage, including some of its most important buildings, and understand how past approaches to repair and restoration have shaped what we see in the landscape today. We wanted to inspire research, and we wanted to inspire communities to engage with their local heritage. We wanted to inspire other architects to deposit archives in accessible digital formats. And we wanted to promote the public's enjoyment and advance their knowledge of not only the historic buildings, but of the archives that we hold at the Hive, and of particular of the Charles Archive. So work on the project started in January 2018, and Tegan and I worked on this project over the course of 12 months. In that time, over 1,000 archival quality digital images were created and deposited with ADS. So ADS is the Archaeology Data Service, and you can deposit archaeological archives with them, and they make those accessible online. We also created lower resolution images, and these are available via the Worcestershire and the Worcester City Historic Environment Records. A selection of images was also deposited with the National Heritage List for England to help enrich the list. So if you ever look on the National Heritage List for England, you'll see that Historic England put a call out to the public to help enrich the list through information and through photographs. So we've also fed into that. We had a huge program of public outreach, and this led to the creation of 20 blogs, 3 project newsletters, 2 timber frame trails, 1 for Worcester and 1 for Droitwich, and a series of published articles, including In Context, the Worcestershire Recorder, the Archaeologist, and the Bromsgrove Browser as well. Both trail leaflets are available on Explore the Past, and we also have hard copies as well. And I should just point out that all of the outputs that we created as part of the public outreach campaign, they're all available still online via our website on Explore the Past. So you can go in and look at them in your own time. So it's very unusual to have a project that really does cut across all of the different services, but this really was a hugely collaborative project. We had staff from the archives, staff from digitisation, HR and advisory, which Tegan and I are both from, conservation and the historic buildings team, all involved, as well as staff from Worcester City Council. We were also hugely fortunate to have some amazing volunteer support. And we also had support and information and photographs from the Charles family, as well as former employees of the Charles practice. And this gave the project such a huge amount of depth, and it really created a project that we initially could have only hoped to achieve. So that was really wonderful. So during the course of the project, it also became clear that there was a sizable collection of slides within the archive that would benefit from being made digitally accessible. So as I mentioned initially, we had funding initially to digitize around 1,000 items from the archive. But we came across this slide collection, and obviously slides are less accessible than the rest of the physical collection, and they're also at a greater risk from deterioration. So we put in a variation request to Historic England, and we also applied for additional funding from the Vernacular Architecture Group, and this was submitted in early 2019. These applications were fortunately met with a lot of support, and as a result, as well as the initial 1,000 items, we have digitized over 2,000 slides and photographic negatives. And again, all of these have been made publicly accessible. So here are four examples of some of the slides. These are all from the northeast of the county, so some of you may recognise them. We've got Lane House in Feckenham there on the top left. We've got the magnificent Mere Hall on the top right. A lovely little thatched cottage called Shell Cottage, bottom left. And I'm sure you all recognise this building on the bottom right. I'm not going to talk about it too much because this is one of sort of Tegan's examples in her half of the talk. But that, of course, is number 1 High Street in Bromsgrove. We don't know exactly when the slide was taken, but we have a broad date of between 1960 to 1983. The remainder of the 3 slides date to the 1950s. Drink. Okay, so who were Freddie and Mary Charles? Now, Freddie, of course, is the most well-known of the two, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard of FWB Charles. He was, of course, a nationally recognised expert in the conservation and repair of timber-framed buildings. He was born in 1912 in the Wirral, and he trained as an architect at the Liverpool School of Architecture. But initially, he dreamed of pursuing life as an artist. And here on the right, we have one of his drawings that the family kindly showed me and allowed me to photograph. So he was a very talented artist as well. After qualifying, he travelled extensively, including to the Soviet Union, and this inspired his beliefs in egalitarianism. He also travelled to Malaya, where he went to live and work with his first wife, Nancy, with whom he had a son, Martin. At the outbreak of World War II, Freddie moved back to London, where he worked alongside modernist architects Maxwell Fry and Walter Gropius. In the later stages of the war, he moved to Edinburgh, where he served on the Central and South East Scotland Regional Planning Committee, and it's here that he first met Mary. Now, his studies of vernacular buildings in the Scottish lowlands really led to his later specialisation in timber-framed conservation. In 1948, he took up a teaching position at the Edinburgh School of Architecture, and he set up his own private practice. Now, in 1952, Freddie and Mary moved themselves and their practice to Bromsgrove after Freddie took up a position at the Birmingham School of Architecture. His study of timber-framed buildings across Worcestershire led to an MA in 1963, and it also led to collaboration with other leading vernacular scholars, including Walter Horn, with whom he surveyed Lycourt Barn, and again, Tegan's going to talk about Lycourt Barn later on. He also worked with Abbott Lowell Cummings, as well as Nicholas Pevsner. By the early 1960s, the practice had moved to Worcester, and Freddie, Mary and their children had renovated and moved into Churchill Mill. Now, we've got some really interesting articles which describe life in the mill. This beautiful article, which again was shown to me by the family, is particularly poetic. And I had to include this quote. I think it's absolutely beautiful. The first time the present owner set eyes on the old mill, it seemed to be drowning in a tide of undergrowth. Rain was pouring through holes in the roof, and all the, oh dear, what have I done there? And all the, I can't see because I've got people in front of me, there we go. And all the windows were broken and brambles were climbing inquisitively through gaping first floor openings. A theatrical set for a production of Rip Van Winkle seemed a more fitting description than a prospective home. I do love that. We also have some really interesting information from the Birmingham Post, and this is from an article, Mill by Stream, Now a Home, that was written in 1964. And this is particularly interesting because it not only reflects the Charleses' approach to converting the mill into a home, but it also reflects their philosophy when it comes to converting historic buildings. And again, I love this second quote. Mr. Charles says, I am often asked by clients to restore ancient buildings which are to be lived in, to their original state with fake windows, fake fireplaces, and leaded lights? My answer is that if I were to restore them, as for example, an Elizabethan house, it would not only be completely uninhabitable, but would also fail to pass the bylaws. The interest in these ancient houses is to retain something of every age, and the secret of preservation is to preserve the best of each age, including our own age of refrigerators, washing machines, and central heating. Now, Freddie's interest in timber-framed buildings had become further reinforced when, while living and working in Bromsgrove, he became involved in attempts to save historic buildings in the town that were threatened with demolition. In his interview for the National Life Story Collection, which is fascinating to listen to if you ever get a chance, again, it's all online, Freddie says that on moving to Bromsgrove, he and Mary were overwhelmed by the timber-framed buildings. Now, post-war investment had stimulated development across the UK, and Bromsgrove, like many other towns and cities across England, was experiencing considerable change during this period. Dismayed by some aspects of its redevelopment, which included considerable demolition and rebuilding of the town centre, much of it to facilitate cars, the Charleses became involved in attempts to save some of the town's historic buildings threatened with demolition. In fact, it was the demolition of 23 to 27 Worcester Street that stimulated Freddie Charles and his many supporters, including Christopher Cadbury, who donated both money and land, to establish Avoncroft Open Air Museum. Now, the concept of open air museums had originated in Scandinavia, and Avoncroft, which was founded in 1963 and which opened in 1967, was the very first of its kind in England. Now, this is one of my favourite pieces from the archive. I absolutely love it. It's a sketch perspective of the proposed conversion of 23 to 27 Worcester Street. Freddie obviously did this prior to demolition being approved. And why I love it, it's reflective of the Charleses' collaborative approach to conservation and managed change. In essence, constructive conservation, finding new and creative uses for historic places. I mean, sadly, this building was demolished, but fortunately, it was surveyed fully before its demolition, and it was re-erected at Avoncroft, where you may know it as either the Bromsgrove House, the Merchant's House, or the Townhouse. So there we have two photographs, one of the building in situ, looking a little bit sad and dilapidated, and one during its reconstruction at Avoncroft. So originally built in the 15th century as a single hall type house with a solar cross wing, as I said, the building was fully surveyed before its demolition, so that it could be re-erected at Avoncroft. And I do love this quote again from Freddie. "We are not buying buildings just because they are nice, but because it is the only means of saving them from destruction. A building's history is in its site, and to take the buildings away is to give local authorities the excuse to destroy everything that they want to destroy. But if all else fails, then the museum is the last line of defense." So those of you who know Avoncroft, who have visited Avoncroft, will know that it's home to around 30 historic buildings and structures, and these date from the medieval period all the way up to the 20th century. Now, this is another wonderful example of a building that was re-erected, of a roof that was re-erected at Avoncroft. It is the roof of a medieval monastic guest hall, and it was built around 1326 by Prior Woolston de Bransford. Now, the roof of the Gueston Hall of Worcester Priory had initially been saved back in 1862, when it had been preserved in the newly built Holy Trinity Church in Shrub Hill. And this image down here shows the church. But in 1965, the church closed and the roof was once again at risk. Now, an evening news article that we uncovered that had been deposited as part of the Charles Archive, and which dated to the 14th of March 1967, stated that the newly established Avoncroft village was making plans to purchase and re-erect the Gueston Hall roof, but that they were not the only company looking to acquire the structure. So it seems as if there might have been a bit of a bidding war. We have another article from the Sunday Mercury, which dates to December 1967, and this reports that Freddie Charles was seeking £10,000 to support the move. It also sheds light on a fascinating early design for a concrete substructure to support the roof, which was designed by Freddie's long-standing friend, Ove Arop, and it was a complete, sort of more a brutalistic engineering solution, and it was commended by Freddie, who jokingly refers to it as a megalomaniac bus shelter. Obviously, Avoncroft was successful in purchasing the Gueston Hall roof after Holy Trinity was eventually pulled down in 1969. Now, Freddie was particularly interested in the structural techniques of timber-framed buildings, and his philosophy to repair and restoration, which Tegan will talk about more, was often met by controversy from bodies such as English Heritage and the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings. He's said to have had a great eye for detail, and he became well known for understanding form, joints, and construction sequences. He was a long-standing member of the Vernacular Architecture Group, and he was a founding member of the Icamos Wood Committee. The Charles practice was also responsible for the accelerated resurvey of listed buildings in Herefordshire and Worcestershire in the 1980s. Now, it's often said that Freddie saw himself as fighting for the history of the common man. He was a member of the British Communist Party until the 1960s, when he and Mary left over the Soviet Union's actions in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. But he remained committed to communist philosophy, traveling extensively throughout the Soviet Union. Again, this drawing, kindly sort of shown to me by the family. It's a beautiful drawing by Freddie himself, and it shows himself and his elder brother John, who became a vicar, almost showing their conflicting ideological paths in life, but then resolving their differences and finding common ground later in life. I think that's a beautiful, beautiful picture. Now, a lot of you may recognise this photo. It's a well-known photograph of Freddie, and it was taken by his son Martin Charles, who was a photographer. And I can't do a talk on the Charles Archive without paying homage to Martin's talents as well. We found a lot of photographs which were copyright Martin or Reba in the archive. Martin is very well known himself. He came to photography late after a career as a film editor with the BBC and later Pinewood Studios. And he was one of the first architectural photographers to embrace the potential of colour photography. And he's described as having had an eye for the making of things, for materials and construction. He worked with Freddie and Mary, and his photographs were used to illustrate many of their works, including Freddie's monograph on the Great Barn of Bredon. As I said, we found many of his photographs within the archive. His archive was given to Reba following his death, but we were very grateful with the help of his wife and also from Reba. We were given permission to incorporate them as part of the digital archive. Okay, so Mary Charles or Mary Logan, well, when we started this project, we knew very little about Mary Charles, and I was determined that I was going to do her justice. But I was only able to do so because of the support from the Charles family. So we were very lucky that we were able to get in contact with Freddie and Mary's 3 children, and they were more than happy to talk about their mum, and they were happy to fill in the gaps that we had. They all felt that their mother's contribution, not only to the practice, but also to Freddie's legacy, had somewhat been overlooked and undervalued. So Mary Logan was born in 1924 in Ayrshire in Scotland. She was the 3rd of 4 children, and she attended St George's School for Girls in Edinburgh, which had been founded in 1888 by a group of women led by a prominent Scottish campaigner for women's education and suffrage. Her older brother Bill was an architect, and this may have greatly influenced her own career path. Now, Mary's architectural training was put on hold when in 1945 she was called up to serve on the Central and South East Scotland Regional Planning Committee. And as I mentioned before, this is where she first met Freddie. Mary and Freddie went on to marry, and they had 3 children. Mary wasn't able to resume her architectural studies until 1959, after her youngest child had started school. She qualified in 1961 and became an associate of the Royal Institute of British Architects in 1963. So here we have a quote from Mary Charles's memoir. "War was still on while I was at college. I was called up while I was in 2nd year, probably 1945. The alternatives were, oh dear, were since all services were full, munitions or a reserved occupation. The college head fixed for me to join the South East Scotland Regional Planning Committee being set up. It consisted of geographers, economists, historians, and architects, one of whom was Dad." Now, Freddie and Mary's architectural practice in Bromsgrove and later Worcester was very much a partnership, and Freddie was very supportive of Mary working. I'm told that Mary ran the day-to-day business, managing schedules and finances, and her shared passion for timber-framed buildings clearly inspired Freddie's research. She was also a very talented illustrator, and her drawings were used in many of Freddie's publications, as well as their joint publication, Conservation of Timber Buildings, that was published in 1985. And here we have part of a survey. It's a very long sort of survey drawing of Friar Street in Droitwich. Their daughter Nikki said to me that Freddie and Mary loved their work, and that conversations about conservation, crook barns, and preserving buildings in danger of being bulldozed were commonplace around the dinner table. Mary's quiet commitment to women's education and equality, and her very quiet determination to follow her own path, I think deserves recognition. And I was so pleased that we were able to recognize that, recognize her contribution as part of this project, because I really do feel that she was a pioneer in her own right. So as Nikki said, not many married women during the mid-1950s and early 1960s were working, let alone looking after 3 children, qualifying for an architect's degree and assisting in running a business, but she seemed to think it was all perfectly normal. So I'm just going to finish my half of the talk with a few examples from the archives. Now, these aren't Bromsgrove related, because I'll leave that to sort of Tegan. So these are from elsewhere in the county, although this first one is relatively local. So I do love this. It's Ancient Cottage versus Water Tower. And I really chose these three examples because I wanted to show you the diversity of projects that the Charleses were involved with, and the diversity of the archive that we hold. And of course, remember that when we have digitized over 3,000 pieces of material from the archive, but the archive itself is much more extensive. So Piper's Hill in Dodderhill is a listed 17th century cottage with mid-19th century and 20th century alterations. It's timber framed with plastered wattle and door panels and a thatched roof. And it's a beautifully quaint cottage, but it was at the very centre of a debate when a scheme was submitted to erect a large water tower right next door. As you can imagine, Freddy was outraged. I mean, the impact to the setting of that beautiful building is clear from the image here, and he made his views clear. Unfortunately, the scheme went no further than plan form. My second example, and another favourite, relates to the now demolished Dowles Manor in Upper Arley. So Dowles Manor dated to around 1600, and it's thought to have stood on the same spot as a 12th century stone building that was partly demolished and rebuilt to form a half-timbered house. The walls were constructed of wattle and daub, and many parts of the interior framing were reused timber, but the main timber construction was all new in the 16th century. The house was laid out in a typical 16th century plan form, with a hall occupying the central ground floor, leading to a kitchen wing on the left and a solar on the right. Now, in 1908, beautiful paintings were discovered in the hall, the dining room, and a number of the bedrooms, painted in layers directly onto the interior surface of the wattle and daub. Images include a vase and floral motif, a continuous interlocking design thought to represent the Holy Thorn, and even a female bust in Elizabethan costume, thought to be Queen Elizabeth I. We also have this continuous frieze here at the top of each panel, and that depicts scrolls, mythical beasts, female figures, flowers, and shields bearing the fleur-de-lis. Now, in one of the bedrooms, we have a painting which shows the master and mistress of the household depicted in Elizabethan dress with a passion flower above them. And on the opposite side of the room, we have these words: "God's peace be here, amen." And underneath that, we have inscribed dates of 1622 and 1636. And there's also some initials, we're presuming added later. Now, in 1982, and this really reflects why things like the Charles Archive are so important, the house sadly caught fire and was badly damaged. What was left was sold to the final owner, who in 1993 was found to have demolished part of the house to rebuild a new house in its place. The owner was fined and ordered to demolish this new house, leaving virtually nothing of the 16th century building. The house was delisted in 1994, and the whole site was sold at auction in 2017. We're very fortunate to have the records in the Charles Archive on this fabulous, fabulous building. My very last example, and we're going moving along to Redditch. And again, yeah, I've chosen this one because just to again show the diversity of schemes that the Charles practice was involved with. So this last example is related to material that's related to a scheme to redevelop Forge Mill and the Bardsley Abbey complex. So Bardsley Abbey and Forge Mill are both scheduled ancient monuments, so they're scheduled as nationally important sites. Bardsley Abbey encompasses the earthwork and buried remains of buildings and animal enclosures associated with a Cistercian abbey that was founded in 1138 and demolished in 1538. There's also the remains of a 13th century chapel, a water mill, a system of fish ponds and workshops. And then you have Forge Mill, and this was a forging mill that survives as iron mill workshops, a water wheel, and an engine house. And this mill was converted to a needle scouring mill later on in 1729, and it was actually in operation until 1958. So a hugely significant, nationally significant site. This scheme appears to date from the early 1960s, and it was developed by Freddie Charles. And we have a report in the archive which recounts how, at a meeting of the subcommittee of the District Council in October 1962, it was resolved that the preservation of Forge Mill should be planned in conjunction with the development of the entire Bardsley Abbey area. So they were looking to preserve the area, and they were looking at ways in which they could preserve these nationally important sites as part of a larger scheme. So the scheme then goes on to detail a proposal for a landscaped park with a zoo, a children's playground, a miniature golf course, car parks, a running track, an open air theatre, football pitches, cricket pitches, a fairground site, and boating facilities. So a huge scheme. Freddie stresses in the letters the need for visualising the area as in the nature of a reserve. And he argues that there should be no attempt to create the trim and artificial scenery of a typical small town park. One of the most intriguing proposals mentioned in the report is that relating to the establishment of a zoo. So wildlife parks became increasingly fashionable from the 1950s, and they hit their peak in the 1960s. The first stage of the zoo's development was for a restaurant, an aviary, a monkey house, and possibly lions and tigers, and various free-range animals and birds. The restoration of the old watercourse running parallel to the River Arrow, as well as the fish ponds, were anticipated for sea lions and penguins, and an area of land was also imagined as a deer park. Now, of course, the development of the zoo never progressed beyond an idea, but fortunately, the restoration of Forge Mill and the preservation of the ruins of Bardsley Abbey did. And of course, in 1983, Forge Mill was opened as the National Needle Museum, and I'd recommend a visit for anybody who hasn't been. So that is my part of the talk. I'm going to turn the presentation off and allow Tegan to open it on her screen so that she's able to run the slides. Okay. So hang on. If I turn that off, just please bear with us for a couple of minutes. There we go, Tegan.
Okay.
I am sorry, I've gone over time a bit, haven't I? So apologies for that.
It's okay. Sorry. Oh, bear with me 1 second. Sorry, it's got a bit comfy. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about Freddie's research, his theories, techniques, how he restored his timber frame buildings, and some of his campaigns. So Freddie's research really centres on the Crook Frame style of framing and how this style is a basis for other timber framing traditions seen within our county. So a true crook is an archaic form. The earliest example within the UK dates from 1262, which is from a pub in Nottinghamshire. And this form uses a curved timber within the frame that runs on each side of the building from the base to the roof. So the example that we can see on the left-hand side here, this is at Lycourt Barn, which I'm going to be talking about a bit later on in the talk. So this is an example of the true crook. So the most obvious relation to the true crook is the base crook, which had a relatively short span of use for around 100 years from 1250 to 1350. And the example that we've got here is on the far this side, which is from Rectory Farm at Grafton Flyford. So we can see there are curved timbers which extend midway up to the roof, and they support double cross beams. Now, this type of construction is also seen in aisled buildings, such as those at Breed and Tithe Barn, and it's widely accepted as an amalgamation of the two styles, the crook and the base crook. And then box frame buildings have similarities with crook frames, usually in the design of how the roof fits onto the upper side of the rafters, which is seen in the middle. This is shown on the roof this is shown on the roof drawings of Court Farm in Upton Snodsbury, seen in the middle, this bit here. So a feature of many crooks within the county is this presence of a central ridge purlin, which became ridge boards in many modern roof constructions and is still seen within modern roof construction still today. So let's have a look at Freddie's techniques. Freddie's architectural practices can be recognised today by other conservation architects and buildings archaeologists alike, as he set a benchmark for both practices, whereby he laid the foundations to make it a common practice to go out to an historic building, survey it, record it, then go back into detail and survey the problem areas where conservation and restoration is required to enable a conservation strategy to be drawn up and then followed through. Now, as we can see here, I'm sure a lot of you will obviously recognise this is number 1 High Street, Bromsgrove, which was redeveloped between 1960 and 1962. So this building was a former inn with its decorative street frontage rebuilt in around the 1600s. So this is actually quite a similar style seen in Shropshire. If you think of the gatehouse at Stokesay Castle, or maybe some of the buildings within Ludlow. So obviously he's taken his pictures. There are internal timbers suggesting that this building had medieval origins, which is seen in this massive arch truss, seen in this photograph here taken by Freddy. So we can see that he's obviously taken photographs before and after the renovations. He's surveyed the building. He's produced a phasing plan. We don't have the conservation strategy for this building, but we can see that from comparing the 1960 photograph here and the 1962 one here, that the internal space of the timber frame building has been opened right out for office use. And the adjoining building, which we can obviously see here, is in a more modern style. And to kind of just to talk a bit more about this modern style that Freddie had. Freddie's architectural style for new builds was this modern style that we can see in these 3 examples here. So this top example was going to be a building built at Avoncroft. It was called the Terrapin building. It was never built, but his design, as you can see, it's this nice modern flat roofs, and we can see the same in this example from Tardy Big as well. And then this example here is a doctor's surgery, which actually is in Bromsgrove, and I think that was actually built, from what I can see on Google Street View. But it just shows this consistent style, as we've just seen next door to number 1 High Street in Bromsgrove. So the common theme behind his techniques for historic building restoration is to take buildings back to this main building phase, which Emily just touched on in her talk, as to whatever period that happens to be. So an example of this can be seen here at a building called Strand House in Bromsgrove. So this building had internal remains of a medieval hall house, which is seen in the central roof truss and seen here on these scallop mouldings in the roof. But Freddie noticed that more of the later 17th century alteration and construction survived. So to Freddie, it made much more historical and architectural sense to advise to reconstruct this building exactly as it stood in the 17th century. Unfortunately, this didn't happen as it was subsequently demolished, but his principles can clearly demonstrated here. Now, a project that you may have heard of in Droitwich certainly did propose and execute this principle at 31 High Street, or as it was previously called, Stevens, as we can see on this photograph here. We can see from this photograph that this building has a rather unassuming rendered frontage from the 19th century, but is actually hiding a 3-bay timber-framed 14th century hall house with original solar wing. Just to give a little bit of background to this property, Freddie actually surveyed this building in 1967 and described it as the finest solar yet discovered in Worcestershire. Back then, the building was used as a hardware shop and has remained as a shop in some form or other ever since. It was listed in 1973 along with a row of 2 other buildings. However, the interior back then wasn't inspected, and the listing wrongly stated that all 3 buildings were 19th century shops. The listing was then changed to include the medieval features sometime after this. However, in 2013, this building was put on the Historic England's Heritage at Risk Register because inadequate guttering and a leaking roof was allowing water into the building, which in turn was rotting the timber frame structure. So in 2017, Historic England gave out a repair grant, and Nick Joyce architects firm undertook the renovations to save this building from collapse. The building was stripped back, repaired, remodelled to its original medieval form with jetted first floor and decorative roof eaves and window frames using traditional timber and woodworking techniques. The project was finished in early 2019, and it just shows how far-reaching Freddie's influence even remains today and for the next generation of architects. So as we can see here, this is the finished article. So yeah, pretty amazing. And just as a side note, because I know Nick is listening, Nick Joyce actually worked with Freddie during his early career, and obviously he set up his own practice after Freddie retired in 1989. So now we're going to have a little look at some of Freddie's techniques for renovation and restoration. So Freddie's understanding of timber can be seen within all of his buildings that his firm restored and conserved. So a Middle Littleton tithe barn here, we can see the splice joints that Freddie has used here, which splices together old, so this is the old timber and this is the new timber in order to repair it. And we notice here as well that that the grain of the old and the new timber matches up, and this isn't only for aesthetic reasons but for structural reasons as well, because Freddie understood that by doing this the old and new timbers would move in the same direction after the building has settled, after it's been restored. And we can obviously see further examples where he's used the same kind of splicing together of old and new timber to add strength to the building. This is at Bretfordton Grange, and this example at Breedon Barn. He also used bolted ironwork, which follows more of a crude 18th or 19th century repair method. But again, this just added further support to the timber frame joints, which can be seen here at Breedon Barn in this example here, and it was extensively used at the commandery in Worcester as well. And this example here, this is Lycourt Barn, which we can see Freddie's experience of both a conservator and an architect come into play here, because he's actually used steel stanchions, pins and concrete to repair this crumbling brick plinth. Obviously you can see where the crook would have attached to the bottom here. So we can see from this drawing, the modern structural elements are hidden within and behind the original new traditional materials, so that on the outside the original character of the building is still maintained, but obviously we know that there's modern materials being used here to help support the building. So Freddie was also a pioneer of his time in using new scientific methods to date historic buildings, one of which was radiocarbon dating, which was developed in the 1950s. And it determines the age of organic materials based on their content of radioisotope carbon-14, which is acquired from the atmosphere when trees, things like that, are obviously alive. So carbon-14 decays into a nitrogen isotope, and this has a known half-life. So it's the measurement of the remaining carbon-14 that gives us an estimated date range. And the other technique that he used was dendrochronology, which was developed in the 1970s. So this looks at the growth rings that a tree produces during its lifespan, which produces a sequence of wide and narrow rings depending on the climatic and environmental conditions the tree was subjected to during its lifespan. And these sequences can then be compared with others from a similar geographic location and time frame. So again, we're going to be going back to Lycourt Tithe Barn. So Freddie used both of these dating methods when trying to get a more accurate date for Lycourt Tithe Barn. So just a little bit of background for this building. This Crook barn is the largest known in England, 42 metres long, which is 140 feet long. It's divided into 10 bays with trusses almost 10 metres high, spanning 10.4 metres or 34 feet. And this kind of building is known as a True Crook construction. So you can see the crook is on the wall plate there, and it goes up to the roof. And this kind of building was used for storing stacks of hand-cut corn sheaves at either end of the building, and then the central bay was used for threshing out the grain to make beer and bread, animal feed, and then the straw that left behind was used for thatching and stuffing mattresses and animal bedding and that kind of thing. So it was this that Freddie collaborated with Walter Horn. Now, he was a specialist in medieval architecture, and his own archive is currently held at the Getty in Washington. So together they conducted an initial survey of the barn in the late 60s, obviously when preservation and conservation of historic buildings was only really just starting to develop. And 2 samples of wood were taken for radiocarbon dating, which gave a general data around the 14th century. So a third was made, and a better date of 1325 was produced. Then dendrochronological analysis was also undertaken, and unfortunately these samples were taken from the crook blades, where these unfortunately were young, fast-growing trees, which basically means there was too much variation in the tree ring patterns to produce a conclusive result. So despite this, though, Freddie really did pave the way for these techniques, particularly the dendrochronology, to still be routinely used even now, when buildings archaeologists and the like are dating and recording buildings. And from 1987 to 1989, English Heritage funded the restoration of the barn. And in 1988, it was designated as Grade 1 listed and taken into English Heritage guardianship. Now, dendrochronology was again carried out in 2006 by Historic England, and a more conclusive date of 1344 was eventually reached. So in Bromsgrove, although this wasn't carried out by Freddie, but in Bromsgrove, dendrochronology was actually undertaken at numbers 85 to 87 High Street. And this was applied to the internal oak roof structures. So these buildings are Grade 2 listed. Number 85, which is obviously here, has 16th or 17th century origins, and the wood samples were taken from the roof timbers. However, again, seems to be the way of these things, they didn't give any usable results. However, charring on a couple of the samples did show evidence of localized fire damage. So although a conclusive date for either building wasn't really made, another aspect of the building's history was uncovered instead. But again, this further shows that even now, Freddie's techniques are still being applied to buildings today. So now we're going to just move on to some of Freddie's campaigns. So we're heading back to Droitwich. So Freddie, among others in his day, was a great believer in preserving and reusing historic buildings to serve a new purpose and use within the emerging modern world. Freddie was heavily involved in trying to save historic buildings from demolition during the wave of new developments in the 1960s, one of which was Chorley House in Droitwich. Both Freddie and his wife Mary surveyed this building in 1960, and they stated that it was a fine example of medieval timber frame construction. The building is reputed to have been part of the Augustinian friary founded in Droitwich in 1331. Now, this building dates to the 14th and 15th century and was made up of a hall and 2 stories at each end with side wings. And the building was made into a townhouse after the dissolution and was then made into 3 separate houses during the Victorian period. However, by 1960, the building was in quite a serious state of neglect and was under threat of demolition, despite, even at this stage, being Grade 2 listed. So a scheme for its conversion into the county branch library was commissioned with the idea of preserving the building as it stood and to retain part of the inserted Elizabethan floor as a gallery for part of a children's library over the upper bays of the hall. The structural frames for the hall and the west wing were sound at that time, and Freddie suggested that this west wing should have been extended if Friar Street was to become more of a pedestrian precinct. And it was the east wing, though, that required much more drastic reconstruction, I think, as we can see in this slide here. And it was due to this that by 1962, the conversion into a library was deemed far too costly, so the building was subsequently demolished. And then this next example, so we're heading over to Evesham. This is a little known building that stood on 53 to 56 Bridge Street in Evesham. This is quite a hard one to actually find on our maps and things in the HER. So Freddie went out to survey and record this in 1966 and found that, again, this building was hiding a 4-bay 16th century structure that aligned along the street and may have once have been originally jettied. And the jetty that we can see in this picture is actually from the 19th century. So these buildings, again, were subsequently demolished. And sometime after Freddie's survey, you can see his annoyance at demolishing an historical building that otherwise was structurally sound. As you can see, as he writes on his survey plan, there's no earthly reason why these buildings should be demolished. So now we're heading back to Redditch. The Redditch survey that Freddie was involved with was completed in 1969 and was produced for the Redditch Development Corporation as a kind of inventory and condition survey of what historic buildings remained with the rapidly developing area east of the River Arrow. So what we have in the archive is the report and sketches that Freddie made of each of the buildings, the majority of which were actually historic farmsteads. And the examples that we have here are Ipsley Court, a 16th century mansion, Marlfield Farm, a 17th century farmstead, and Claybrook Farm, the earliest with possible 15th century origins. Like many other farmsteads and historic buildings within the survey, the latter 2 unfortunately were demolished. And some of Freddie's comments clearly emphasised the battle he and other people seem to have in preserving these historical buildings at the time. And this is a quote from his report. It is clearly too late to save all or even most of them. 2 farmhouses and their steadings have already been demolished, and the advanced state of the new works leaves little hope that the plan could now be adapted to avoid further destruction. But the plan is not the only threat. Neglect and decay, and what an 80-year-old resident expressed to me, they don't mind what they do now, will soon have gone too far for the restoration of even Ipsley Court. which is this lovely sketch that Freddie did here. But thankfully, Ipsley Court and its outbuildings did survive, and it was actually restored and to form offices and apartments. So now we're heading back to Bromsgrove, and we're now looking at 81 to 83 High Street. Now this building again was under threat of demolition in the 1960s. So Freddie surveyed the building and made a report, which then prompted him to write to the Bromsgrove Messenger in April 1968, further outlining why he felt the Bromsgrove Planning Committee should not demolish this and another building, which was the Green Dragon Inn, which was an 18th century Grade 3 listed building, which once stood opposite Church Street, but obviously that one was actually demolished. So back to 81 to 83 High Street. This building dates from between 1700 and 1720, and its construction out of brick and stone would have stood out quite prominently at the time, as most of the other buildings along the High Street at this time would have been timber framed. And Freddie's report found that the upper floors have suffered quite a lot of water damage from leaking guttering, which was made worse through boarding up the access to the upper part of the building. Now, this building does remain, however, it's not quite in the form that Freddie recorded back in 1968. And it's not quite as he wanted it to be retained either, as we can see that the water damaged upper floors were taken away, and the frontage has been removed to make way for a modern glass shop frontage, which evidently Freddie really seemed to have hated, as he's quoted in his report as saying, this form of glass frontage has destroyed all ancient shopping streets in England. But despite all of this though, this middle section with its decorative mullion windows remains. And obviously having Freddie's detailed survey and reports allows us to keep a record of what was once there. So now to end, I think Emily has already said that there's been over 3,000 images that have been digitized and deposited with ADS, which are available to view online right now. The original images are also available to view at the archives, and as Emily said, you know, there's a wealth of things. There's loads more than what we've obviously showed you today. And further images are also available to view digitally from the Historic Environment Record, which obviously we're also based at the Hive. And we're hoping to have the archives and HCR desk open from around the 12th of April. But of course, we're going to be keeping everyone updated via the Explore the Past website and other social media. So just watch this space.
I'll also just add as well that as well as being online on ADS, we've also now gone European because the digital archive is accessible from Europeana, which I'm not quite sure how much of Europe it covers, but so it's accessible across borders now as well, which is lovely.
Brilliant. Emily, Tegan, thank you so much. That was an absolutely fascinating talk, really enjoyable and great to see the two sides from you both. Sadly, I'm rather struck by the fact that nothing changes, does it? I mean, as a society, we are fighting at the moment for the preservation of some old buildings that people want to demolish, to put a roundabout, to build extra houses, etc., etc. And sadly, it seems that these battles continue to go on, to sadly not to preserve these buildings so that they can be reused in the way that that Freddie Charles obviously advocated for. But thank you both for a fascinating talk. Now we are going to open